Neil,
How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm so happy to see you. And we're not going to take a lot of time because I think, first of all, your time is valuable. And secondly, I think it's a summer Monday, it's July 29th, and I think they have a lot of other things that they're doing. But I really thought it was important for us to hear what your thoughts were. Finally, I don't know if you think it's a good thing, what some of these changes, sweeping changes that President Biden, is trying to introduce legislation that will actually decrease the power of the Supreme Court. Anyway, it's a constitutional law called the No One is Above the Law Amendment, 18-year term limits, and a binding code of conduct. So tell us about these things. By the way, you guys, I am so sorry. I look like absolute shit tonight, but what are you going to do? Anyway, Neil, tell us what you think about this and if it's a good thing. And by the way, I'm drinking a cucumber jalapeno pepper margarita.
Uh,
So
well, Katie, I have to say, even on the days when you claim you look like S word, you still look better than all of us. So it's
I
great
don't
to.
think so, Neil, but you put it some more.
um,
Anyway, what do you
so,
think of all these things that he's proposing?
so there are three things he's proposed today. Number one, to try and overturn this latest Trump decision, which isn't just about Trump, it's about every president, in which the Supreme Court said you may have official immunity, you can do whatever you want, and not have the criminal law apply to you. That's always been crazy, start to finish. I wouldn't have thought we needed a constitutional amendment, but I'm glad to see that he's calling for one. The second thing he's calling for is ethics reform, and having the justices have a binding code of ethics that applies to them and the like. That's a harder question, but I think because of some of the recent controversy around the justices, it's not surprising to see President Biden talking about that. And then the third one is to have 18-year Supreme Court terms. Right now, our Constitution, all the way back to 1789, Article 3 says if you're on the Supreme Court, you have your job for life, to life tenure. And this proposal says that's a long time, particularly with modern medicine. Life tenure in 1789 meant something very different. And so instead of this weird roulette game which we play where some justices get sick and others don't, and sometimes you'll have a Republican president, whatever, let's just make it a standardized rule. Now, I've been in favor of 18-year terms since 2003. So I'm glad to see, 21 years later, that we're finally getting some momentum with the president endorsing it. And the logic behind it is to say, if you go back over American history, the average length of a Supreme Court justice was 18 years. It's just that in the recent times, it's been kind of stochastic, and you've had some people serving for a really long time and some not. It gets very unseemly. Remember all that, kind of almost actuarial discussion of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the like. And so there's, I think, a lot to be said for it. It requires a constitutional amendment. So that's really hard. In our Constitution of 1789 says to amend the Constitution, you need two-thirds of Congress and three-quarters of the states to agree, and you can't get them to agree on anything, basically. So it's, these are in some ways kind of, shots across the bow by the president. They don't have any effect right now, but, I think it's going to prompt something of a national conversation, and that's
Well,
good.
let's talk about, I'd love to talk about this ethics or binding code of conduct, because I know they tried to do that before, Neil, and it didn't have any teeth, right? And then when someone suggested John Roberts meet with some members of Congress, correct me if I'm wrong on this is what I recall reading, that he said, I'm not going to do that. It's not my role to meet with members of Congress to talk about some kind of ethics reform. So can you just kind of talk about that? Because didn't Elena Kagan, who, by the way, worked with my late husband, Jay at Williams and Conley, and seems like a very nice person. But anyway, didn't she say she was in favor of some kind of stronger ethics code of conduct, ethical code of conduct, or whatever you want to call it?
Yeah, And I was Justice Kagan's deputy and have a lot of affection for her. And last week, she came out and said she thought it was a good idea that there be a binding code of ethics and that it could be policed by lower court judges, experienced lower court judges who could tell the Supreme Court when something was, going over the line.
Right.
And you wouldn't think we would kind of need that because the truth is, for most of the court's history, we haven't needed it. Justices have stayed really far away from any sort of line. But every so often there have been problems, and there have been some recent problems with some justices accused of taking lavish trips,
We talked about
millions of
Clarence
dollars in.
Thomas, and then of course there was the Samuel Alito flag flying incident that really seemed to do, seemed that they were doing some of these things with impunity, I guess, and thought that they would be protected, but they do seem out of bounds with what has been generally accepted by a Supreme Court justice. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, certainly if you go back over time, I don't think we've seen much of the conduct that some of the justices today have been engaged in happening, for the last 200 years. Like my model on this, Justice Kagan, when someone sent her, a law school classmate sent her some bagels from New York, she returned them saying, that's an improper gift. And this is like some, classmate, no business before the court, nothing like that. That's the way I've always thought of government service. I wouldn't take a French fry from anyone, and that was basically how I thought. And so I think the problem is some justices have had a different view, and that's prompted this national conversation. And I think Justice Kagan has a really good point in saying, look, let's just standardize the rules and make them binding for everyone. The argument on the other side, Katie, has always been the Supreme Court is different because the Supreme Court, when some justice is recused, that person is knocked out and not replaced. And so there's always a game at the Supreme Court, or not always, but sometimes in high stakes cases, to try and recuse a justice to try and influence the outcome of the vote. And that's different than other courts. Like if I argue a case in the Court of Appeals and a judge is recused, they just swap in some other Court of Appeals judge. There's no big deal. And you don't know who that judge is going to be, so you can't game the system or anything like that. But at the Supreme Court, you know who the nine are, you know a fair amount about their kind of proclivities. And so unfortunately, we've seen litigants try and weaponize recusals. And so that's been I think the strong argument on the other side. And that argument is held today in part because justices had engaged in so much self-restraint, so it never came up. But now it's obviously coming
So
up.
So I guess the question is, it sounds unlikely that these things would be ratified or whatever in the way they have to. You said it would require 2/3 of Congress, and what percentage of the states?
Three quarters.
3/4 of the states. So, is this an exercise in futility? Is there a possibility that any of these things would be enacted? Because after all, the Supreme Court's public approval rating recently hit a record low,
Yeah.
38% after it granted Trump partial, whatever that means, criminal immunity. We talked about what that means actually, but we don't have to go into it now. But a lot of people are very suspect about the impartiality of the Supreme Court, and it's become so intensely politicized. Was it always this way, Neal, or is this a more modern
No,
occurrence?
this it's happened before. It happened in 1935 to 1937. It happened in 1857 with the Dred Scott case. We've had the Supreme Court at the center of national politics a couple of times and being out of step with mainstream American society. And it's never turned out well for the court or for the country. And I fear that we may be entering that phase now. And we're also entering a phase in which the hyperpartisanship has made it hard for sensible solutions to emerge. Like, for example, I would have thought, right, we're behind the veil of ignorance on a presidential election. We don't know who the president is going to be in November. This is a perfect time to have the amendment that President Biden's suggesting about no criminal immunity for presidents, because it might be a Republican president, might be a Democratic president, whoever it is, nobody
Yeah,
should
but
be
no
above the law.
Republican is going to go for
Well,
that, Neal.
exactly. So now the question is why? Because they know their person is going to break the law with impunity. And they know the Democrats wouldn't do that. And so why would they unilaterally disarm and get behind the Biden amendment? And so that kind of it's not just the courts politicization and perceived politicization, it's also the politicization in Congress as well. And those two things together make it basically these proposals are proposals. They're not going to be
But
passed,
I think the
unfortunately.
fact that we're even discussing it, I think maybe the Supreme Court, that they will take notice that, I don't know, maybe they'll moderate themselves a little bit. What do I know? Just because this is being brought up.
Yeah, no, I think that there's some possibility of that. This is a court this term that really was very hyper aggressive. Some people call it the YOLO court. You only live once. They're grabbing everything. And, the greatest book in all of constitutional law in the last 100 years was written by Alexander Bickel back in 1962. It was called The Least Dangerous Branch. And the argument Bickel said is that the court only has its legitimacy. It doesn't have armies to enforce its judgments or anything like that. And the only way it can protect its legitimacy is by not doing too much. By not doing, basically, is what Bickel said. And we now have the kind of anti-Bickel court, one that's really grabbing so much under the sun and reversing precedent after precedent. And
Even though they said in their confirmation hearings that they had no intention of doing so. Have
yeah, so I mean,
confirmation hearings become just a joke?
Um, well, I, it's hard for me to understand if you line up the testimony with the decisions, how they are consistent. I suppose what they may say is, well, that was me speaking as an individual, but now that I'm part of this court, which is very far to the right, I didn't think it was my place to dissent or something like that. I can't really justify things like what happened in Dobbs. I mean, it is, Dobbs was the hardest case for the Supreme Court to decide that way because, Roe versus Wade came down in 1973. It was a 7-2 decision written by a Republican appointed justice to the Supreme Court. And then in 1992, when everyone thought Roe might go away, it was a trio of Republican appointed justices, O'Connor, Souter, and Kennedy, that said, no, Roe is a super precedent. Whatever you think about it, it's embedded into the fabric of our law. It's the hardest thing to overturn. And yet in Dobbs, they overturned
Hey,
it. That
Neal,
kind of, yeah,
go
I was just going to say that kind of really aggressive thing is why you see President Biden today talking the way he's talking. And it may not ultimately culminate in a passed proposal, but it is going to be a huge part of the campaign, I suspect, because we do have a Supreme Court that's out of step with where mainstream America is.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it has become politicized, and now it is inevitably political for a lot of people who are going to the polls. One thing I wondered why President Biden didn't include this is I always thought it was so crummy that Mitch McConnell wouldn't even meet with Merrick Garland.
Yeah.
Can't there be some kind of rule put in place that if it's a certain amount of time between the naming of a Supreme Court justice, I guess because Justice Scalia had died,
Yeah.
right? And that's why they wanted Merrick Garland in there, and that was President Obama. And yet Donald Trump appointed Supreme Court justices much later
Yeah.
than in his term. So why can't there be some kind of rule? Because that just makes me crazy. Why should one person be able to nominate a Supreme Court justice so late in the game and get it through, and another person won't even have a meeting with the Senate Majority Leader? It makes no sense to me.
That's exactly right. I mean, Justice Scalia passed away, I think, on February 13th, 2016. The election was in November, and Mitch McConnell and others said, oh, you can't have a confirmation hearing for Merrick Garland because we should have this be a referendum for the next presidential election.
Uh-oh.
So, okay, that's a bad enough crazy Looney Tunes position by itself. But then 4 years later, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg unfortunately passed away, I think in around September, they nominated Justice Barrett within a few days, and they turned around and said, oh, of course we can confirm someone right before the next presidential election. It's just a yo-yo game with no integrity behind it
I agree.
whatsoever.
so
Yeah.
why wasn't that included in some of the recommendations or the ways to reform the court? It seems to me there should be an agreement on a certain timetable where it's a legitimate opportunity to replace someone and when it's too close to the election. It just seems unfair to me.
Yeah, but I mean, the truth is, let's say that Garland got the hearing. He still would have needed to get a majority vote, and Mitch McConnell had the votes to block it. And so the timing of a hearing or even the timing of a vote isn't by itself enough, particularly when you have people who are just hell bent on bending the court to whatever their own preferred politics are. I mean, this is one thing in which I do have some sympathy for the court because it's not just the court that's become political, it's Congress and the Senate that's politicized the process so much. So, it's both actors together.
Hey, someone asked how much are Supreme Court justices paid.
I think
They
it's around 225,000. It's around
this
that.
person says, I'm not happy about the trips and gifts. I can't take gifts as a workers' comp adjuster. I'm also tired of the ridiculous spending in inaugurations, especially for a reelected incumbent. I don't know if that has anything to do with the price of beans at this point, but I think the point is, should they be paid more? I
I mean,
guess.
maybe they should be paid more, but regardless, it can't ever be an excuse. Every government official, I think of the people in the military who make less than that and who do the most important thing imaginable for our country. The last thing we'd want is for them to be like, oh, I'm not getting paid enough. I should, take this gift or that gift or whatever. So, pay numbers is a very different question than
What do
behavior.
you think the justices think of all this conversation? Are they embarrassed, do you think? Are they supportive? I guess it depends on the justice,
Yeah,
right?
I can't speculate as to
Yeah,
that.
I
But
respect that.
yeah.
You don't have to. So I guess the question is the final question, because I told you I'd only take you for 20 minutes, um, is like, to what end? I mean, how can this, I guess two questions in one. How can the Supreme Court um, win back the public's trust? And is there anything that can be done that may not be as considered quote unquote as extreme as what President Biden is suggesting? Is there any way to bring back integrity, I guess, to the Supreme Court
Yeah.
for those people who have lost respect for the body?
Yeah, I do think that there's a way, and the path lies with the Chief Justice. Chief Justice Roberts really does care about the institutional legitimacy of the court. He reveres it. I don't think that he was successful this year in moderating where his colleagues went. And he then, joined those opinions, including the Trump opinion, which he wrote. So it will require a change from where things were going this year. And I would locate that, probably that impulse coming from him, maybe a bit from Justice Barrett as well, maybe some others. But there is a possibility, and I don't think we can give up on it because, the Supreme Court is the crown jewel in our American democracy. It's the court that gave us Brown versus Board of Education and Obergefell versus Hodges about marriage equality and so many other important cases. And I understand the frustration out there. I respect what the president said today. But at the same time, we do need to think about how can we come up with sensible solutions that move the court into a better place.
Especially if President Trump is reelected. I mean, the direction of the court has already taken is only going to get more extreme. I mean, that's just a fact.
Yeah, I mean, given the kinds of people that he's talked about, yes, I think we would have to worry that the court right now, which is already, as I say, well out of step with mainstream America, could get even further out of step. And that is something very worrying. And so I suspect we'll hear a lot about that from the vice president in the days to come.
All right. Neal, great to see you. You're so
Thanks.
smart. And I always love, no, seriously, I always love talking to you. You can just pull these dates out of your ass. I don't know how you do that, Neal.
Well, It was a very shocking day. I was teaching a class when Justice Scalia passed away. I mean, and we got the news, and I was teaching constitutional law, and I said to the class, "Well, everything's going to be very different after that." So,
Wow, these momentous occasions that kind of etch themselves into our consciousness and never leave. Neal, always great to see you. Thank you, and hopefully this is helpful, everyone.